Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Big Girls on the Move crowdfunding campaign to place 20 boxes of colouring books into 20 domestic violence shelters. Happy International Women's Day to everybody right across the world. It's really a global movement. And if you'd like to share this with your friends, that would be fabulous. So today's topic is about the Women's Village. And I'd like to pay tribute to International Women's Day by sharing some of the stories from behind the walls of domestic violence shelters. And yesterday I had the fabulous opportunity to attend the Women's Safety Services annual launch of the poster. This is the second year that the poster has been launched to celebrate International Women's Year. This year's artist was Josie Wilson, and Women's Safety Services, that's their logo there, beautiful mandala, is one of my creative partners. We work in partnership from a number of programs, and it's been many, many years I've been working with the women at Women's Safety Services. Back when we were a much smaller village, actually, when all of the domestic violence shelters in the city I live in Adelaide, South Australia, were independent little shelters across the suburbs. As time has gone on and things have changed, we now have a large body called Women's Safety Services South Australia, and under that many of the domestic violence services, not all, but many, come under that umbrella, which means that we have a much stronger political presence and opportunity to share our resources. And from that, there's been some changes in the Women's Village. I was interested to read that International Women's Day actually started on the 28th of February. I forgot to write the actual year. It was earlier last century when the Socialist Party in America organised or dedicated the day for the 1908 garment workers who were on strike. Or was that in 1908? Women who were protesting against working conditions. So it actually began as a political move to improve conditions for women, and since that event it has spread globally, and many of us attended International Women's Day events yesterday. So it's a pretty amazing movement that is really growing in its magnitude. We know here in Australia that our Prime Minister Scott Morrison made reference to that the women should not, the movement should not come at the expense of men. Now, I won't actually go into any commentary about that, but if you go into Twitter at the moment or any social media outlets, you'll see there's been quite a bit of backlash to that statement. So what about the Women's Village? I truly believe that the place where women gather in domestic violence shelters, but across many other women's services, but I'm particularly familiar with DV services, that it is a form of a village. So although typically villages are places where families grow, communities develop, and people are born into a village often, the metaphor is that within the women's village, the women who work there play particular roles in the women's lives. The women who support that shelter or that village, and also I'd like to acknowledge that there are also men, as I did in one of my earlier videos, who support the work that we do. But inside of the walls of a domestic violence shelter, it is women who are caring, supporting and advocating for women. Often in that environment, a woman will come at that very first point of crisis. For example, she may be brought there by an emergency crisis worker. She could possibly have spent the night in an emergency motel. She is in danger. Danger is very present for her. And there'll be many issues that are of her concern in those early stages, and some of those issues will actually carry through. But some of the particular concerns can be her pets that have been left behind, and again, I did reference this in an earlier video, but it's fabulous to see now that the women's domestic violence sector are working with like the RSPCA and NGOs, charities that look to foster pets who are at risk. Unfortunately, pets are at risk in domestic violence, and that is a whole topic of its own. So shelters are a place to keep women and children safe. And safety is really foundational for any of us to be able to reach our potential and create the things that we want to create in life. One of the women who I worked with many years ago in a shelter, she drew on the example that she said, "I think that the staff here believed in me before I believed in myself." Sometimes I think we just need someone or some bodies to hold that belief for our future and support us in putting things in place when we really don't know the next step to take. It's quite common for women to say, "I'm prepared to do what I need to do to redevelop my life and to move in the direction I want to go, but I don't know where to start." So the first place to start on the road of recovery and personal development is really to begin within. And when I say that, I reference that as the breath, just to take that first breath. To just allow that breath to come in at a deeper level so it can start to settle down some of that chaotic thinking that comes through the chaos of violence. Trauma has its own area of research and development and trauma recovery. We're very familiar with the term post-traumatic stress disorder. So all of these things are very relevant in women's lives. There's also the very practical things like income, housing, medical appointments, doctor's appointments. So within the Women's Village, staff members will be very experienced in supporting women to get those, to access those resources and those things that they need. If a woman arrives at a shelter and she's had all of her paperwork destroyed, which is not uncommon in domestic violence, staff will support her to get her the identity points that she will need in order to start to get those services. So there's a lot goes on. We refer to it as case management, and within the case management process, there's the very basic things such as her income and her health needs, and then there's a variety of things that will be specific to her particular needs, such as if she has children, looking at the children's needs for their schooling or the children's support. And of course, legal appointments. If she's putting a domestic violence restraint order out, then she'll need court support. So I'm guessing that you're probably getting a pretty good idea that behind the walls of domestic violence shelters in that women's village, it's very busy, which is why it's so important to have processes that can be slow and calm, and that's what happens in our colouring and conversation circles. For those who are familiar with the campaign to place the 20 boxes of colouring books into 20 women's services, you'll know that throughout the campaign I've been sharing some of the ways that we're using those tools. And in next week's video, I'll go into one more of the pages from the book. So over the years, I began working in shelters in the 80s, and they were really very anonymous. They were often houses that had been allocated through state housing, or sometimes there may have been a place that has been come from a private donation, but generally speaking, we would work in partnership with state housing, small organisations, staffed by volunteers often, maybe with one paid position that came from quite a small government allocation for women's services at that time. And so services were very localised. Often staff members would come from the area where the shelter was. We would often see staff members who had a background perhaps as being a foster mother, who really brought that experience of what children in crisis need. And through the 90s, things changed somewhat. There was the professionalising of the field, as it was called then, where family support worker training came through as a certificate, youth worker training. So we really saw a new direction. And with that came a different kind of accountability to funding bodies, which is always good, that agencies are accountable for the money they receive. And some agencies formed coalitions. So the agency I was working in at the time formed a coalition with another women's service in the southern area. And the field became more high profile, and the conversation of domestic violence became more known in the media. And then fast forward through to a few years ago, where Rosie Batty really took the conversation of domestic violence to a much higher public level. We now really have very public and robust conversations about funding, about legislation around domestic violence. So we've seen an astronomical shift in the profile of domestic violence. But still, throughout all of these changes, the day-to-day business that goes on inside of a domestic violence service is supporting a woman at the point of crisis and offering her choices around the things she may want to proceed with in her life or not, particularly around the court cases and some of her decisions around housing. Access to the children is a very big topic in shelters, particularly if the perpetrator has been known to be violent towards the family but is now seeking access. It's a very complex topic. So some of the questions that were asked is, where do women go after the shelter? And there are a number of services that support women after the crisis point. Most shelters have what we call outreach housing. So after being in the safety and security of the shelter, she'll go out into a community house. That brings up new challenges around feeling safe, not having now the women's village around her. That's why it's important that there be the ongoing support of the personal development programs, safety programs, domestic violence training programs. So all of these are a really important part of her ongoing recovery. So sometimes women choose to go interstate and to really start again, because if a perpetrator is a stalker or is really determined to find her no matter how many safety structures are in place, sometimes leaving the state is the only option. Another question that people sometimes ask is, how long can she stay at the shelter? And that varies. Most shelters, from the point that a woman arrives and case management begins, the goal is to be looking at her longer term housing. But every woman has a different story and every woman has a different need. So there's flexibility insofar as how long she can stay in a shelter. And one of the really important things, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is her ongoing support, because it is a journey. Many women will know that it is not over just at the point of being safe or charges laid, that there's a lot of complexities after that. We know that on average one woman a week has been killed in domestic violence in Australia, so these are actually very critical conversations. So how do we bring some lightness to that story? And that does come through the processes of like the colouring and conversation circles, like the Big Girls on the Move campaign that we're making possible. We have 5 boxes of books that have gone into domestic violence shelters. And I'm extremely thrilled to share the story that in this coming week on March the 13th, so I'll be able to share some of the story after that, in partnership with Women's Safety Services, we're launching a book, Women Colouring for Peace, the book is called, by the Circle of Women. And this is specifically for migrant and refugee women who have experienced violence. The book has been created by and for women from migrant and refugee backgrounds. It's being produced in 7 languages, pardon me, and it is separate to the Big Girls on the Move campaign. So my partnership with Women's Safety Services is a fabulous one. Having come from the smaller village together and been doing different projects and campaigns over the years, it's just such a delight to work with an organisation in partnership where we recognise that getting the hands involved for the women, getting creativity happening and sitting around the table, sharing stories. We had 15 language and cultural groups represented in our Migrant and Refugee Women's book. So March the 13th, that book will be launched. And if you do work in the DV sector in South Australia, books will be available to pick up for your service at no cost, because we had this program funded, which we're extremely grateful for. And at the further development after we've launched the project is I'm really interested to look at how we can share the tools from this project digitally. So it doesn't, you don't have to live in South Australia to access the Migrant and Refugee Women's Colouring Book. We'll be able to share it across the world because of the power of digital media. So that's very exciting. So I'm just going to have a look now to see if I have any comments have come up on my page. Not quite sure, pardon me, where I have a look at that. So no, my wonderful producer David Salomon is saying no, there's no comments there at the moment. It's probably a good opportunity, a segue for me to thank David Salomon, my producer and business partner, for setting up our studio here. And we also do social media training, so send me an inbox if you'd like me to share some of those processes with you. So in closing, you are able to subscribe to the Big Girls on the Move campaign, and we're going to make a download available to our subscribers. It's the Breathe Deeply mandala. I don't think I have it on my screen here. By subscribing, you'll receive our updates, campaign news, any campaign developments that we'd like to invite you to be a part of. You'll receive those updates. The information will be on the screen there about how to subscribe. And in closing, the Big Girls on the Move campaign is a success because of your generosity. I'm extremely grateful for the generous donations through my birthday week. That was totally, overwhelmingly fabulous. And from that, we now have half a box. We have the full box for Catherine House funded, and the half box that will be going to NINCO, Aboriginal Women's Domestic Violence Service. What art and creativity and imagination really bring in to women's lives at the point of that crisis, at that point of real uncertainty and trauma and terror often. Creativity gives the mind the opportunity to slow down. We discuss things like illuminate the possible. Yes, we need to process and deal with what has happened and what is happening, but there's also a future there that will be free of violence and will give you the opportunity to create the things you want to create. And we do that through the colouring and conversation circles. So if you do have any questions or any comments, leave them on the comments section before, and I'll pop in a little while and answer them, or enter any conversations you'd like to have, any questions you have about today's topic. So again, happy International Women's Day to women everywhere. Thank you to the men who believe in the empowerment of women, and I'll see you on Tuesday at 11 o'clock for our next conversation. Bye.